Today we are in section 179, the 11th hour worker, which is one of these phrases I think sometimes people know about, but maybe not necessarily know where it's from. But it's from this parable in section 179, which is Matthew 20, verses 1 through 16. In this setting of a landowner, this shows definitely the pre-AD 70 conditions of the situation where there was an absentee landowner, and then people worked the land and then were paid wages for that. So there's people that came at different hours of the day. Verse 3, to work. The third hour is 9 a.m. and the sixth hour is noon. Verse 5, ninth hour is 3 p.m. Just by the way that they reckon time from getting up at 7 a.m. And then the 11th hour worker, okay, working the last hour, and they all received a denarius, which a denarius was 1 day's wage. Now, the landowner, of course, represents God. Typically, in these parables, the king or the owner is representing God, not in every detail, but in the main emphasis of the parable. And then the last workers, the 11th hour worker, was representing the tax gatherers and people like that. The earlier ones represented the religious leaders, but you don't press every part of the parable, because the religious leaders were not really following God if they rejected Jesus. But the point was those that came in at the very end. So they were all paid a fair wage. A denarius was 1 day's wage for a common day's labor. In today's value, it'd be around $50, $60 today. But understand, wages have gone way up as far as the amount of money in today's times, even though it's worth less and less. A dollar today is worth less than a dollar a year ago or 5 years ago, etc. So it's hard to convert a monetary value. Also, because with buying power, we have a whole lot much more buying power today. I mean, with money back then, there wasn't much choice in what to buy, and it was the staples of life. They would be amazed walking into a grocery store today, if they could come into our time and see all the many choices we have, which they didn't have. So it's hard to convert from one to the other, but just say a day's wage for a common day's worker. Where I live in Arlington, there are certain places in town where men who don't have work will gather. Then through the day, people will come and hire them to do day labor and then pay them for the day. So that's a common situation today, but probably not as common as back then. Well, the ones that worked all day or most of the day griped about it, and the landowner said, hey, I paid everybody a fair wage. If I want to go overboard for those that worked less, it's my choice. Verse 13, friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? In other words, to work for a denarius. Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish to do with my own? Or is it your eye envious because I am generous? Thus the first shall be last and the last first. All right, so they started different times of the day. The earlier workers griped, but they really had no reason to, because they were paid a fair wage. They were just irritated that those that didn't work as long were paid the same wage, which this also has application. You can receive Christ late in life. You still get the same salvation that I got when I prayed to receive Christ at 9 years of age. But the difference is, of course, I've had these years to serve the Lord and to do His work that He wants to do through me. The person who accepts Jesus on his deathbed does receive salvation, but they've missed this lifetime of being able to serve God and to do God's will. So that's not the same in that regard, but the salvation that we receive is the same. So, if somebody gripes about, well, might as well wait till the end. Well, you don't know if you'll have time at the end, or that in other words, you may die before you realize it. And then also you put that off, again, you miss this lifetime of serving God and the joy that comes about from being part of his kingdom. I think those are all good answers. The parable shows the mercy of the landowner and the sovereignty. All right, so again, not every detail of the landowner applies to God, but these do. All right, so understand that a parable doesn't have every point that has application, but there is usually one main point. Okay, section 180, then in the Synoptic Gospels, that is the third prediction of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. He talks about being raised on the third day. And the Synoptic Gospels, all three record Jesus giving this 3 times. Now, so how many times did he give it? At least 3. So, I mean, I say at least 3 because there's a lot that Jesus said and did that the Gospels don't record. So he could have given it 4 and he could have given it 40. You know, I doubt 40. But we know at least 3 times he did. So I put at least in there because, again, we don't know that this was the last time that he did, and maybe there were times in between. But I think 3 is a significant number of times. So Mark 10:32, they were on the road going up to Jerusalem. It was always up spiritually, even though it was also high as well, topographically. Jesus was walking on ahead of them. They were amazed, and those who followed were fearful. And again, he took the 12 aside and began to tell them that what was going to happen to him, saying, "Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests." Again, here's a divine passive. This will happen to him, and I believe the point is God is doing this. It's in God's plan. And they will condemn him to death and will deliver him to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit upon him and scourge him and kill him, and 3 days later he will rise again. So we'll be delivered. I think this is a divine passive, certainly likely. In other words, it is passive. The question is it divine passive? I think so. Chief priests and scribes. So the religious leaders are the ones who will be the instigators of this, though it will involve other people. And so then gives a lot of the description about what they will do to him, not just crucify him, but they will mock him, spit on him, scourge him. I believe he was scourged more than they typically did to a person being crucified. That was a bad enough punishment as it was. I don't think they typically scourged a person a lot because that would hasten crucifixion. I believe they did for Jesus, but that was worse than what was normal. And then be raised up, again, a divine passive. Now notice what Luke says in Luke 18:34, and they understood none of these things. And this saying was hidden from them, and they did not comprehend the things that were said. So this is certainly different from the Jewish expectation about what would happen to the Messiah. And excuse me, I believe that's why this was so hard to understand. It was just, they had no comprehension of the Messiah dying, and certainly not of rising again, though that is clearly in Scripture. The Jews missed that. You know, unfortunately, most Jews still miss that. Most Jews look forward to the few that do. Most Jews today are not religious, but the few that do look forward to a Messiah that will lead them, but nothing to do with death, burial, and resurrection or anything like that, because they've long ago applied those scriptures to themselves. Well, look, a lot of us Jews, a lot of us have been killed and things like that. So that's how they miss that. So the disciples miss that. Unfortunately, the Jews do for the most part today as well. All right, so they didn't understand. But, even after Jesus was killed, they obviously didn't understand because they didn't hang around, except for Peter for a while, and then except for John. Okay, section 181 in Matthew and Mark, a prideful request. So Matthew says, Matthew 20:20, then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came to him with her sons, bowing down, making a request of him. And he said to her, okay, Mark 10:35. And James and John, the two sons of Zebedee, came up to him, saying to him, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you, which is always so it's not a good way to start a question for the person being asked. Yet somebody, they say, hey, I want you to do whatever I ask, or I want you to promise me you won't say no or whatever, or won't laugh when I say this. What? You can't make that promise. Because when they say that, it's obviously going to be something that you're going to either laugh, they don't want you to laugh, or whatever. So my answer is always, well, tell me first. I mean, what's going on here? I'm not going to make a promise I can't keep. So what's the deal here? Matthew says the mom asked, John and James are the one who asked in Mark. So here's clearly an alleged discrepancy. Well, I think the key is that the mother is behind the request, and there is a tendency of this next point. Matthew tended to not mention the middleman. So in other words, James and John, I think, were the ones that asked at the bequest of their mother, so they were the middlemen. I think they were in agreement with that. They obviously wanted to sit at the right and left hand and be at the best place, but it was the mom behind that. So I think with that understanding, Matthew often did not mention the middleman, but then they're both saying a legitimate way to tell the story. In other words, if you tell an abbreviated story, then you'll just say who wanted the request and who did or didn't give it. A longer version would say, well, there was a go-between actually, and there in those additional details. So the storyteller can give or omit certain details, and that's fine, as long as they don't make up details or as long as they don't erroneously report details. All right, so what was the request? To sit at the right and left hand of Jesus. So he asked, let's continue with Mark, what do you want me to do? They said to him, grant that we may sit in your glory, one on your right and one on your left. All right, so those were the best positions. So they're saying we want to be higher than the other 10 disciples, and we want to be in those major places of power. Jesus answered, Mark 10:38, you do not know what you're asking for. For really, literally, they're asking to be crucified on his right and left hand. It's the point Jesus is making. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink? That's the cup of suffering. That'd be the crucifixion. Or to be baptized with the baptism with which I'm baptized, which would be complete immersion in that death by crucifixion is what he's referring to. And they said to him, of course, not having a clue of what he's talking about, we are able. And Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink, you shall drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized. In other words, he's talking about later when they do die. But to sit on my right and my left, this is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. All right, so of course, then the other 10 get mad about that because they then learn about this, and there was a continual jealousy among the disciples. All right, so they didn't realize they're really asking for the cross. Jesus does say they're going to suffer martyrdom ultimately, but not to do that when he does it. All right, and it's God's call to assign the right and left. So this was clearly a power move on their part, instigated by the mother, and so that's why the other 10 became indignant. So Jesus gives this as uses this as an opportunity to then address how they ought to be. So verse 42, he says, that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. You may have worked under someone who was a power-hungry leader, and the power went to their head, even though they didn't have much power. But they were the foreman or woman over you, and so they'd boss people around, stuff like that. I've even seen that in the church, where there's a junior executive that's put in charge of a committee, and so he's a junior executive at work, so he's pretty lowly at work. But you give him some power at church, and he just starts ordering people around. He thinks he's got all this power that he wields not too well. So I've seen that time and time again at the church. So we have to help people be reminded to be humble and don't let power go to your head. As Lord Acton said years ago, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So then that's our sinful nature. Give someone power and they typically go overboard. Verse 43, but it is not so among you, all right? Christians shouldn't be like that. Now, we're not called Christians yet, but that's what he's talking about. God's people. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. So I think servant leadership is the way a Christian should be. Not a tyrant boss or leader, but a servant leader. How was Jesus a leader? He was clearly the leader, but he served his disciples. He hadn't done it yet, but he washed their feet. He ultimately gave his life for them. So I think that's the best example of a leader is a servant leader. So whoever wishes to be first shall be your slave. And then leads up to verse 45. Wonderful verse. For even the Son of Man, of course referring to himself, did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. So he's our leader. So let's learn from him and what Jesus came to do, and not make God a cosmic bellhop, all right? He's got to meet all my demands because I have that right, name it, claim it. No. God sent Jesus. Jesus was servant to us, and we ought to be servants to him, is the proper way to understand that. So a beautiful verse. Give his life a ransom. Well, a ransom is what you pay to get someone back. And, of course, we've separated ourselves because of sin. But God paid the ransom. To whom did he pay it? No. That's always the wrong guess. But he paid it to himself, really, yeah, or to his wrath. In other words, that's a good illustration of how, or good example of how every illustration ultimately breaks down if you press it too hard. All right, so you pay the kidnapper a ransom. Well, did Satan kidnap us? Well, I mean, really, we made the decision for sin. Is our own stupid decision. And the price was not paid to Satan. So it's a beautiful picture that payment was made on our behalf that is only applied if you willingly receive it. In other words, receive the gift of salvation. But it wasn't paid to Satan. So I asked that question because, a lot of people just go, oh, ransom paid, I guess it's paid to Satan. So where do you put the money? First Bank of Satan or whatever, I don't know. But of course the ransom price was the payment of Jesus. So it's a beautiful picture, but you don't press every detail of that. All right, so Jesus showed servant leadership, which I think is there's several great take-homes from this event and what Jesus said. But I believe that is the greatest type of leadership. Yeah.
References are wrong. Matthew chapter 20.
Oh, 10. Oh, 20. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Gold star for you.
Yeah, on the notes are wrong.
I put that in there just so that you would, if somebody would notice that. So I'm glad you've noticed. Nobody else did. Shame on all you people. Yeah, wake up. All right, yeah, thank you. I need to get that changed. So, and it's wrong in 10:27. It should be 20. I guess I had 10 on my mind because the 10 were indignant. Yeah. Actually, I'm sure I typed it right. It's that computer that keeps getting it wrong. Isn't that what y'all tell me? That computer messed up. Okay. That key got stuck. All right, section 182, the healing of blind Bartimaeus in all three of the synoptic gospels. So the city is Jericho. Matthew says as they were going out from Jericho. Mark says they came to Jericho. Luke says, and they were approaching Jericho. So are they coming or going? I mean, sometimes I'm not sure if I'm coming or going early in the morning. But I think they were sure. I think the answer is found in archaeology that there's 3 Jerichos today. But back then there were 2 Jerichos. There's Old Testament Jericho and New Testament Jericho at different locations. Now, I mentioned that's highly unusual because normally a city they build on top of the remains of the previous city. In other words, there's like at Megiddo. There's Megiddo 22, 21, 20, 19, 18, 17. All right, so it builds up to be this large, what's called a tell. And it's a good location, so that's why they build on top of the remains of the previous one. Near farmland, near water, on a crossroads, on a hill for defense. Those four great things for an ancient city location. But sometimes, for whatever reason, they built in a different location. So here's New Testament Jericho, a little ways away from Old Testament Jericho. So I believe then they're referring to different Jerichos. So you could be leaving a Jericho and going to a Jericho. And that may sound like a convoluted explanation to try to pull a fast one and not admit there's a discrepancy, but really this is the only time there's a seeming discrepancy with the city, and this is one of the few times I'm aware of a city being in multiple locations. So I do believe it fits. So it's both is the solution to that harmonistic problem. All right, so another difference is that Luke and Mark mention just Bartimaeus, and then Matthew mentions two blind men. That's fine. That's a common difference in the synoptics where one will focus on one person, and then another gospel will say, well, there are actually two people there, and that's fine. That's an additional detail that the one storyteller doesn't mention and the other storyteller does. Like two angels at the empty tomb of Jesus, but one gospel says there was one, and the two demoniacs. Or was there one? Well, there were two, but different gospel writers focus on different details. Okay, so let's go to Mark again. Mark 10:46. They came to Jericho, and as he was going out from Jericho with his disciples. So here he mentions the one and then the other. Because, he mentions one there, but there's going to the other because Luke mentions going to. A blind beggar named Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, was sitting by the road. So Bar means son of, so that's what Bartimaeus means, son of Timaeus. When he heard it, there was Jesus, the Nazarene. He began to cry out, saying, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Which these were, this was a great messianic term, right? So, but Matthew mentions that there were two, and they cried out, have mercy on us, son of David. But again, it's not a discrepancy. There were actually two. So Jesus then healed them. He stopped. Well, first of all, people told them to be quiet. Verse 31 in Matthew, the multitude sternly told them to be quiet, but they cried out all the more, saying, Lord, have mercy on us, son of David. So we see persistence, and that's good. Jesus asked what they wanted. They said to give us our sight, our eyes be open. And then Matthew, verse 34, moved with compassion, Jesus touched their eyes, and immediately they regained their sight and followed him. Did he need to touch their eyes? I don't think he did. But I believe this was accommodation. So again, typically with Jews, then Jesus would have the touch or involve the spit that they associated with healing. But Gentiles, often he didn't. He could do it. He could do it to any of them long distance, but I think there was an expectation of touch. And so immediately then they were able to see. So, and this wasn't the only time Jesus healed a blind person, but we see fulfilling what the scripture said about when the Messiah comes, the blind receive sight, the deaf will hear, etc. And so Jesus did that along the way. All right, so then here still in Jericho, so Luke continues, and only Luke mentions this section 183, and he entered and was passing through Jericho. And behold, there was a man by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax gatherer, and he was rich. So here's the setting, that's Jericho. Zacchaeus was short, so that's why he climbs a tree. Luke says in verse 3, he's short of stature, small of stature, climbs a sycamore tree so he could see Jesus. Obviously, the people didn't like him. They didn't like tax collectors. He was a chief tax collector, and so had to climb up to see Jesus. And so understand, when Jesus stopped and addressed Zacchaeus, that was just amazing to the crowd. Here's what they probably considered the biggest or worst person in town. Not biggest, but the biggest jerk, I was going to say. And Jesus stops to talk to this guy. So verse 7, when they saw it, they all began to grumble, saying, he is gone to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. They couldn't believe it. But Jesus went to the house of Zacchaeus. And so Zacchaeus then said to the Lord, behold, Lord, half of my possessions I will give to the poor, and if I've defrauded anyone, and I'd say, if, yeah, I'm sure you have, I will give back 4 times as much. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. So, Jesus told the rich young ruler, sell all your possessions, give to the poor. But we've seen that's the only time he ever said that. And here's Zacchaeus, though willingly says, half of my possessions I'll give to the poor. And I believe, since it's recorded that he said he did it, I do believe he did that. But that's showing obviously this was a huge change that Jesus brought in his life. All right, so Zacchaeus, his name means righteous one, which is, of course, ironic by the way that he was living, which was not as a righteous one. So he climbed a sycamore tree, which in Jericho, when it's safe enough to go, which it's not always when I take trips, you can go to the tree that they say, this was the tree that Zacchaeus climbed. There even used to be, they took this sign down. There used to be this sign, that's saying that's estimated that this is Zacchaeus' tree, which is kind of a funny sign because there's a lot of misspelled words. But I would say that's a lot better than I could if I tried to write a sign in Arabic. So I do give them some points for doing that. But anyway, they took that sign down. But there's no way we could know what the tree was. But when we can go there, I like to have the bus pull aside. We get out and sing, Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. So, what I learned as a child. All right, so the people grumbled, and he did become a believer. So how do we know that? Well, I think 2 things. Jesus announced it, but then Zacchaeus also talked about his change of heart. If you become a believer, if you truly become one, that will result in good works. Good works don't earn your salvation, but when you place your faith in Jesus, it will be followed by good works if you genuinely got saved. And that's the message of James, which, of course, James has not written that message yet at this point in time, but it's still true. If there is no change in your life, evidenced by good work, let me rephrase it. If there are no good works, then that shows there was no change in your life brought by Christ. And so we definitely see a difference in the life of Zacchaeus. Right then, the last event before the section of the Passion Week, and that's the parable of the minas. Now, this is certainly similar to the parable of the talents. Now, Jesus hadn't given that yet, but looking ahead to when Jesus gave that on Tuesday of the Passion Week. So, many scholars say, well, this is the same parable. Yeah, different in a few details, but you know that situation when you pass a story around a circle, by the time you get to the end of the circle, a lot of details have changed. And my answer to that is that's a stupid illustration of how the message of Jesus was passed down. When you play that little, what we used to call the telephone game, I don't know what they call it now, but it's just a silly, dumb game that you tell something as fast as you can, and obviously details would change. There's no comparison to the fact of telling something about Jesus, and the people who told it would be people, he changed your life. You're not going to be hurrying through some story and giggling, and as you're going to go, man, let me tell you what happened. So you're going to make sure those details are right because Jesus changed your life, and then the story continues to get told. There's enough details that are different here. I mean, there's a lot of difference that it's ridiculous to say they're the same. Now, what difference does that make unless you're talking to a Bible critic or sharing the gospel? Well, it makes a difference if you ever preach or teach from either this parable or the other one, because there are two different, totally different applications, right? So if you just say, well, it's the same one, some details got changed, then you come up with one application and you're missing the other, right? First, the amount of money is there's a whole lot of difference between 100 denarii or drachmas. Okay, so that's a day's wage. So 100, that's roughly 3 months' wages, is a mina. A talent is this huge. A talent is a huge amount of money. That's 15 to 20 years' wages. All right, so we're talking about a fourth of a year's wage versus 15 to 20 years' wages. So that's okay. So roughly 15 times 445. So let's say 50 times larger. A talent's 50 times larger. So a different amount of, and it's not really money, but an amount of wealth or value. There wasn't a talent coin. It was an amount of money. So very different. And then they're given, it's a different amount of servants, and they're given different amounts. With the talent parable, they're given different amounts. All right. With this one, there's 10 servants, each given 1 mina. All right. So 10 servants. And so then we have the obedient servant that earned 10 minas with his, and so he's rewarded with 10 cities. One who earned 5 got rewarded 5 cities. And then the disobedient one hid his mina. And so when the master came back, see what each one had done, and he gives them these various rewards based on what they did. He says, verse 20, Master, behold your mina, which I put away in a handkerchief, for I was afraid of you, because you are an exacting man. You take up what you do not lay down and reap what you do not sow. He said to him, by your own words I will judge you, you worthless slave. Did you not know that I am an exacting man? So he says these same words back to him. Taking up which I did not lay down and reaping what I did not sow. Which you should have put the money in the bank, and having come, I would have collected it with interest. Now this is interesting. Here's a little side application. For everybody that says, it's terrible to invest money. Terrible to borrow money. Okay, so if you believe it's bad to borrow money in any instance, and some of you may, then don't ever put money in the bank to earn interest, because you're being a hypocrite if you do. Because if you put money in a bank to earn interest, where's that interest coming from? Yeah, the people borrowing money. So I'd say if you believe it's unscriptural to ever borrow money, then you should believe it's unscriptural to ever put money in a bank that gives you interest. So I guess hide it under your mattress, or you could ask the bank not to give you interest. But the problem is they're going to use your money to help loan the money out, so you should never put it in a bank. My point is, the Bible does not say thou shalt not borrow money. You can't make a case biblically for that. Now you can make a case it's dumb to, or unwise to. Certainly it's biblically wrong to borrow beyond your means to pay back. Okay, clearly that's true. Right? It's wrong to borrow beyond what you can pay back. It's wrong, it's unbiblical to not pay the money back. Okay, that's wrong too. But you can't say just borrowing money is wrong. And here, the thing is, and again, this is not the main teaching, but if it's wrong to borrow money, which would mean it's wrong to ever earn interest, then the master should not have said that, because that would be an unbiblical activity. Now, you could say, well, that's pressing the parable too far. Then I'd reply, maybe so. But I'd say you still can't find verses that say, don't borrow money. But you should be wise in it, don't be dumb in it, and don't borrow beyond what you can pay back. And I'd say credit card interest, I can make a pretty good case that's dumb in any for any reason. But I'm talking about, you borrow for a house. I don't think you can biblically say that's wrong. And it's not, and so if that's not wrong, it's not wrong to borrow for church work either. But if it keeps you from giving to missions as you should, that's wrong. If it causes you to presume upon God, that's wrong. But to blanketly say it's wrong, I think is pressing the Bible further than it said. But I want you not to miss that little tidbit there. All right, but the main point is then, what are you doing with what God has given you? But different from the talents. Because as they're given different talents, and remember, talent is an amount of money. But you say, okay, well, he's given us different what? Abilities, given us different spiritual gifts, different opportunities, different talent as far as ability talent. But what's he given us all that's the same? The Minas application. What do we all have that's the same? Not spiritual gifts. What?
Gospel.
The gospel. Yes, exactly. So that's the application here. Oh, it's right there. Sorry, I didn't put that up. I didn't mean to put that up there. I forgot I hadn't brought these up. So, but see, if you make these parables the same, you're going to miss. Usually, you're going to miss this message. Because everybody's used to the talents. Oh yeah, you give them different abilities, opportunities. Yeah, that's true. But what are we all given the same? And that is the gospel message. And the question is, what are you doing with it? And basically, the guy with one did nothing with it. And, very sadly, I think that's the majority of the church today. Does nothing with the gospel message. So, he says, take it. So then he takes that one mina from the one slave, and then says, then verse 24, take the mina away from him and give it to the one who has 10 minas. And they said to him, Master, he has 10 minas already. So doesn't he have enough? I tell you that to everyone who has more shall be given to him, but from the one who does not have, even what does not have shall be taken away. And so, how far do you press that? Well, I do believe that when churches squander opportunities, that God takes their hand off of them. And unfortunately, there's a lot of churches like that today. All right, so we all have the gospel message. And then, now, what about the different rewards? Are there different rewards in heaven and punishments in hell? I think so, based on parables like this. Of course, this would be talking about rewards in heaven. I believe what God has for you to do in heaven will be based, at least in part, for how faithful you are here upon this earth. So that gets back to the 11th hour worker. Yeah, he has salvation, and he gets to heaven, but by the hair of his chinny chin chin, so to speak. And I believe 1 Corinthians 10:3-10-15 talks about that. But I think there definitely will not be the rewards because there wasn't that time of service for him. And I think as far as the degrees of punishment in hell, we get that from places like where Jesus said woe to Capernaum, Bethsaida, and Chorazin, that it's going to be easier on Sodom and Gomorrah, because if they'd seen my miracles like you did, it would have been different. So anyway, that's interesting to think about as far as the different rewards and punishments. Yes.